Welcome to the 12th podcast on direct regulation of the environment. Direct regulation is sometimes referred to as command and control. In this podcast, you are going to hear about technology standard on the one hand and performance standard on the other hand. Technology standard allows for the regulation of technology used in production. Performance standard allows for direct regulation of quantities, either output quantities or emissions quantities. Let's start with technology standards. Such standards describe the technology to be used in production or abatement. That could be catalytic converters, filters, the ban of some inputs in production, zoning, where zoning means that certain technologies are limited to a certain area. The downside of technology standards is that there are small incentives for firms to develop more efficient technologies than the one prescribed. How does profit maximization look like under such a technology standard? Well, firm I maximizes profits given the policymakers' imposed constraints on the abatement technology. So we can model that by assuming that AI has to be greater than AI hat, which is the minimum emission abatement required from the firm by the regulator. The Lagrangian related to this problem is equal to PQI minus CI of QI and AI plus the Lagrangian multiplier lambda times AI minus AI hat. And this leads to the first order conditions. First, related to QI, we get that the price is equal to the marginal cost of production. Second, related to AI, we get that the marginal cost of abatement is equal to the Lagrangian multiplier. And third, related to lambda, we simply obtain the equality between the abatement level of the firm and the abatement required by the policymaker. So the first condition says that the firm produces up to the level where the marginal benefit and the marginal cost of production are equal. The second and third conditions say that if the constraint is binding, the firm will meet the technology standard and will abate exactly AI hat. But this constraint on the technology imposes that the shadow cost of the firm is equal to the marginal abatement cost. Remember that lambda I stands for the additional profit the firm would get if she abated one less unit of emissions. So this is just an implicit cost of abatement, and this is an opportunity cost. Also, note that the choice of abatement technology affects the level of outputs if it impacts on the marginal cost of production. That means if we have the cross derivative which is greater than 0. Because then if we increase abatement by 1 unit, that means that the cost of producing an additional unit of QI will rise. And if this is the case, the first condition is also affected by abatement. Let's compare this with the social optimum. In the social optimum, we had that the price is equal to the marginal cost of production plus the marginal damage on society, and that the marginal cost of abatement is equal to the marginal benefit of abatement, that is, we have a lower marginal damage from emissions. Under the technology standard, we have that the price is equal to the marginal cost of production, and the marginal cost of abatement is the implicit cost of abatement of the firm. So we can say that the socially optimal level of abatement will only be reached if the shadow costs of abatement of firm I is equal to the marginal benefits of abatement. So the shadow costs that are imposed on the firm because of this technology standard must be equal to the marginal benefits of abatement. But as you can see in the table, the socially optimal level of output will in general not be achieved, because the social planner always adds another term, d prime e times e prime qi of qi ai. So the marginal costs that are perceived by the social planner are higher than the marginal cost perceived by the firm in the technology standard. That also means that in a social optimum, we will have lower outputs in general. Nevertheless, we can say that a technology standard is justified if technical information is very complex and available to the policymaker. A technology standard is also justified if firms respond little to price signals. Say there is a monopolist tendency, for example. Also, if there are long-run irreversibilities in investments, it might be better for the firm to get a very clear signal on which technology to implement. Otherwise, the firm may incur very high costs for investment in the long run. This standard is also justified if standardization of technology has cost advantages. So the more firms, for example, introduce certain technology, the lower the price will be of using this technology. Also, if there exists one superior technology now and in the future, then it is pretty clear that which technology to use. There is one more scenario. If the monitoring emissions is expensive compared to monitoring of technology, then it's better for the regulator to impose a technology standard instead of, for example, taxing emissions. Let's turn our attention to performance standards. Such a standard involves quantitative goals that can be expressed as emission limits or emission reductions, either in levels or percentages. The advantage is that it gives firms greater flexibility to choose their abatement method. So the firm can reduce output or increase abatement with whatever technology. This also is a clear incentive for firms to develop more efficient abatement technologies than what we could have with technology standards. How does profit maximization look like under this time a performance standard? So firm I maximizes profit given the policymakers imposed constraint on emissions. So we can model this by assuming that EI has to be smaller than EI hat, which is the maximum emission that a firm can generate after the regulation. The Lagrangian related to this problem is equal to PQI minus CI of QI plus the Lagrangian multiplier lambda times EI hat minus EI. And this lists the first order conditions. Related to QI, we get that the price is equal to the marginal cost of production plus the lambda multiplier times the marginal emissions from production QI. With respect to AI, we get that the marginal cost of abatement is equal to the Lagrangian multiplier times the marginal emission from abatement. And finally, related to lambda, we simply obtain the equality between the emission level of the firm and the emission cap required by the policymaker. What's the interpretation of these conditions? The first condition states that the firm produces up to the level where marginal benefit of production is equal to the marginal cost of production plus the shadow cost of the performance standard. If there is a performance standard, there is some kind of constraint, and if we increase output, we also increase emissions, but we can't increase emissions to infinity. So there is a cap that is set by the regulator, which is why the standard here imposes some shadow costs. The second and third conditions say that if the constraint is binding, the firm will exactly meet the performance standard in terms of emission limits, and this constraint imposes a shadow cost on the firm equal to the right-hand side of the second equation. And again, with no regulation, we would have the marginal cost of abatement equal to 0. But here, as the right-hand side is positive, that means that we have a positive level of abatement. But the question is, of course, will we get the social optimal levels of both production and abatement with this kind of standard? So let's compare this with the social optimum. As before, we have the social optimal conditions on the right-hand side of the table and the conditions related to profit maximization under the performance standard on the left. Now you can easily see that these two conditions in the first row actually coincide if we set lambda I equal to d prime of e. And this is exactly the same that we observe in the second row. So that means that the socially optimal levels of abatement and of output will only be reached if the following condition holds. Lambda I is equal to d prime of e. And that means that if we impose an emission limit that imposes a shadow cost of lambda I on firms equal to the marginal damage on society, only then we will get a socially optimal solution with respect to abatement and with respect to output. A performance standard is justified if there is uncertainty about which technology is best or will be best in the near future, because this standard allows for more flexibility on the technology that the firm wants to implement. It is also justified if costs of monitoring are not too high. If they are very high, if it is very costly to reduce emissions, that it might be better to have a technology standard instead. And this standard is also justified if the policymaker wants a quick and certain reduction in emissions. To sum up this podcast, we can say that with a technology standard, the level of output will usually be chosen inefficiently high, even if we achieve the social optimal level of abatements. And a technology standard also requires relatively much information on how the prescribed technology translates into emission reductions. So that is a huge information requirement on the side of the regulator. On the other hand, a performance standard gives the firms more flexibility in choosing the abatement technology, and also it reduces outputs to a socially efficient level, which can't be obtained with a technology standard.